Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. His name is known all over the world, Aristotle, a philosopher, a scientist, a teacher of kings, a man who was the first in history to try to comprehend and describe the entire surrounding world, from the structure of the starry sky to the behavior of marine animals, from the laws of logic to the organization of the state. His works became the foundation of science, philosophy, and education for thousands of years to come. In this video, you will learn why Aristotle quarreled with Plato and created an entirely new philosophy that changed the course of human thought, why his works have survived more than 2,000 years and are still used today in logic, politics, biology, and even in modern studies of artificial intelligence, and most importantly, why without him, our picture of the world would be entirely different. This is the story of the man who taught humanity to think. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In the year 384 before our era, in the northeast of Greece, in a small coastal town called Stagira on the Chalcidice Peninsula, a boy named Aristotle was born. No one could have imagined that he would become one of the greatest thinkers in human history. Stagira was a modest but lively and industrious town. Its harbor received merchant ships from every corner of the Aegean Sea, and from early morning until late evening its narrow streets were filled with the voices of craftsmen, traders, sailors, and philosophers. The family into which Aristotle was born was highly respected. His father, Nicomachus, was not merely a physician. He held the honorable position of court doctor to the Macedonian king Amyntas III, the grandfather of the future Alexander the Great. Nicomachus came from an ancient family of physicians who considered themselves descendants of Asclepius, the god of medicine. This lineage had passed down medical knowledge and techniques from generation to generation, relying not only on intuition but also on observation, logic, and experience. The family home stood near the sea, away from the central square. There, amid the scent of medicinal herbs, damp scrolls, clay vessels filled with infusions, and gleaming metal instruments, the boy watched his father at work. Nicomachus often received patients at home. Some came with fevers, others with broken bones, still others with mysterious ailments even seasoned physicians could not explain. For young Aristotle, all this was not mere spectacle. It became part of his inner world. He observed how his father gently palpated the abdomen of a patient, listened to breathing, checked the pulse, studied the color of skin and eyes, trying to grasp the nature of the illness through a combination of signs. Nicomachus believed the world obeyed definite laws. He taught his son that human health depends not only on the body, but also on lifestyle, climate, diet, mood, and the environment. For Aristotle, these lessons became his first steps toward understanding that nature was not chaos. Behind the seeming diversity of phenomena lay certain causes. The father often took his son along on his visits, to peasants in nearby villages, to fishermen on the coast, or to wealthy townsfolk. These trips were as important as any books or lectures. The boy saw how nature affected people's health. In lowlands, fevers were common. In the highlands, the air was cleaner. Those who worked at sea suffered different illnesses than those who tilled the soil. Gradually, he began to perceive the connection between human life and the surrounding world as one continuous whole. But the happiness of this early childhood was short-lived. When Aristotle was about 10 years old, his father died. The cause is unknown, perhaps illness, perhaps an accident. Soon after, his mother, Phaestus, also passed away, a woman about whom history preserved almost nothing. Orphaned, the boy came under the care of a relative named Proxenus from Atarneus, a city on the coast of Asia Minor. Proxenus was more than a guardian. He was an educated man who knew philosophy, mathematics, poetry, and rhetoric. He took responsibility for Aristotle's upbringing and ensured him an excellent education for that era. Each morning the boy memorized lines from Homer, then studied the basics of geometry, practiced arithmetic, learned rhetoric, and listened to stories about myths, history, and the structure of the world. Proxenus encouraged curiosity and sought to develop in his pupil the ability to reason, compare, and draw conclusions independently. Special attention was paid to nature. Proxenus took the boy to nearby groves, springs, and seashores. Together they observed the lives of plants and animals, discussing why some trees grew only on dry hillsides while others thrived near water, why certain birds had long beaks while others short and strong ones, why fish needed fins, and how animals behaved before a change in the weather. These observations gradually formed in Aristotle a habit not merely to look at the world, but to seek its causes. While most people were satisfied with appearances, he always asked, Why? Why does the sun always rise in the east? Why do some plants bloom in spring and others in summer? Why does iron sink and wood float? Why are some people healthy while others always ill? From early childhood, Aristotle stood out not only for curiosity, but for a rare ability to organize his thoughts. He sought not just to learn facts, but to connect them, to build chains of cause and effect. If he heard a story about a fisherman, he wondered not only how fish were caught, but why they lived in that particular place, what affected their feeding, and how tides influenced them. If he watched a blacksmith, he pondered why some metals melted faster than others, and how fire transformed ore. By the age of 15, it was clear that the horizons of Stagira were too narrow for a mind that reached far beyond. Proxenus, realizing that Aristotle needed a mentor of a higher level, decided to send him to Athens, the intellectual center of the Greek world, home of Plato's famous academy. It was there that Aristotle's path would continue, a path that would one day make his name known throughout the world. When the 17-year-old Aristotle from Stagira set foot on Athenian soil, he beheld a city that for generations had been the spiritual and intellectual heart of Hellas. Athens was not great for its palaces or fortresses. Its glory lay elsewhere, in the freedom of speech and in the habit of discussing everything, from the order of the state to the nature of being, from ethics to cosmology. On every agora, in every gymnasium, in every shaded portico, groups of men debated endlessly about the world, the polis, virtue, mathematics, the motion of the stars, and even the meaning of life. But Aristotle's goal was not the city itself. Beyond its northwestern gates lay a sacred grove, the Academy, founded by Plato about 20 years earlier. It was unique in all of Greece, the first school built not around a private tutor but around a continuous program of lectures, discussions, a library, gardens, and space devoted solely to thought. When Aristotle entered the Academy, Plato was about 60 years old, a near-legendary figure, disciple of Socrates, founder of a philosophical school, author of the theory of ideas, and creator of dialogues already regarded as masterpieces of thought. From his first days, Aristotle immersed himself in a world where every word, every argument, every assumption was analyzed, questioned, and refined, all in pursuit of truth. Classes began at dawn. Students gathered under trees or in colonnades to hear lectures by Plato or his senior disciples. They discussed every subject imaginable, from metaphysical speculations on the nature of being to practical reflections on the structure of the ideal state. Afterward came long walks filled with debate, logical exercises, and efforts to expose contradictions in arguments. Evenings were spent reviewing unclear points and preparing for the next day. At first, Aristotle was enchanted by Plato's view of reality. The theory of ideas struck him with its grandeur. According to Plato, above the visible world exists a higher, eternal realm, the world of ideas or forms, unchanging and perfect, independent of human perception. Everything we see is only a shadow of these ideal entities. A beautiful object is but a reflection of the idea of beauty. A just act, a shadow of the idea of justice. The sensible world, therefore, is but an echo of the true, invisible one. Aristotle threw himself into all fields of study: philosophy, logic, mathematics, astronomy, and ethics. He mastered dialectic, the art of asking questions, analyzing answers, finding contradictions, and step by step approaching the truth. But as time passed, doubts began to arise. If ideas exist apart from things, how are they connected? If there is an idea of beauty, why do we never see it except through beautiful objects? Is the true essence outside of things or within them? Slowly, these doubts turned into serious objections. The key problem was the relationship between the invisible, eternal world of ideas and the changing, material world. Could philosophy explain reality by removing it from reality itself? Aristotle began to believe that the essence of a thing lies not beyond it, but within it, in its nature and form. He did not hide these reflections. He debated openly with Plato and other disciples, not for the sake of rebellion, but for understanding. If there is an idea of motion, he asked, why do we only ever see motion in actual bodies? If there is an idea of justice, where does it dwell? In laws, in human actions, in our minds, or in some invisible realm? Such questions made him both respected and troublesome. Plato, according to later testimonies, said half jokingly, half sorrowfully, "Aristotle is the colt that kicks against his mother." Yet he admired the young man's intelligence, persistence, and ability to find flaws even in the most elegant reasoning. Aristotle's distinct feature was his focus on the real world. While the Academy explored metaphysics, he studied concrete reality: plants, animals, anatomy, growth, and differences among living creatures. He noted details others overlooked, recording his observations: the structure of fish gills, the asymmetry of mollusks, the behavior of birds in different climates. Though such pursuits were considered secondary in the Academy, for Aristotle they laid the groundwork for a new method: observation, classification, and inference based on experience. Despite growing divergence, he remained in the Academy for nearly 20 years, teaching and writing. When Plato reached 80, the question of succession arose. The leadership passed not to Aristotle, but to Plato's nephew Speusippus, perhaps because Aristotle's views had strayed too far. When Plato died in 347 before our era, Aristotle's long Athenian chapter came to an end. A new one began: a life of travel, discovery, and the search for knowledge. Plato's death in the year 347 before our era marked not only the end of an epoch, but the beginning of a new stage in Aristotle's life. After nearly 20 years in the Academy, he could no longer remain in Athens. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, became head of the school, representing a more orthodox line. Moreover, anti-Macedonian sentiments were growing in Athens, dangerous for someone born in a Macedonian allied city. And finally, Aristotle's philosophy had by then completely diverged from the Platonic doctrine. He accepted an invitation from Hermias, ruler of the city of Assos on the northwestern coast of Asia Minor near the Troad. Hermias was a rare kind of ruler, a philosopher, student of Eudoxus, and admirer of Plato's ideas. He dreamed of turning Assos into a haven for thinkers and scientists. There, Aristotle found the ideal environment for his new pursuits. He and his friend Xenocrates founded a small philosophical community where theory met natural science. Among its students was Theophrastus, who would later become Aristotle's closest disciple and the founder of botany. Aristotle spent long hours by the sea studying marine life: fish, mollusks, and crustaceans. He dissected specimens, noted structures, compared organs, and recorded minute details. He was fascinated by how life adapted to its environment, why some species lived in depths and others near the surface, and how anatomy reflected function. During this time, he also formulated his famous doctrine of the four causes: material, what a thing is made of; formal, what it is; efficient, what produces it; and final, its purpose. This idea would later become a cornerstone of European science and philosophy. But political upheaval disrupted his work. Hermias was killed in a conspiracy, and Assos fell into turmoil. Aristotle fled to the island of Lesbos, settling in the city of Mytilene. There began perhaps the most productive scientific period of his life. On Lesbos, he continued biological research, observing reproduction, growth, nutrition, and metabolism. He compared species, studied embryos, and distinguished between vertebrates and invertebrates. He also began grouping living beings by essential traits: presence or absence of blood, means of respiration, structure of limbs, methods of reproduction, laying the foundations of biological classification. Life on Lesbos also brought personal happiness. Aristotle married Pythias, niece of his late friend Hermias. They had a son, Nicomachus, to whom Aristotle would later dedicate one of his most famous works, the Nicomachean Ethics. Alongside natural science, he reflected on human nature, society, and government: what makes a state just, what virtues sustain it, and what destroys it. These reflections later formed the basis of his politics. But soon, events in Macedonia changed everything. King Philip II, who sought to strengthen his kingdom and raise his heir in the spirit of Greek culture, invited Aristotle to become the tutor of his son, the young Alexander. That invitation marked not just a move to another land, but the beginning of a new era in the philosopher's life, an era in which his destiny would intertwine with that of the future conqueror of the world. When in the year 343 before our era, Aristotle received an invitation from the Macedonian king Philip II to come to Pella and educate his son Alexander, he was about 41 years old. Behind him lay years of study in the academy, scientific and philosophical research in Assos and Mytilene, and hundreds of days spent investigating nature, anatomy, the motions of the heavenly bodies, and the laws of the surrounding world. Now, a new, very particular task opened before him: to educate a future king whose decisions and actions would, in the near future, determine the fate of the entire Hellenic world. Philip II knew exactly whom he was inviting. His father, King Amyntas III, under whom Nicomachus, Aristotle's father, had served as court physician, maintained close ties with the Stagirite's family. Personal connections, strengthened in the previous generation, played no small role. Yet no less important was Aristotle's impeccable reputation as one of the most outstanding minds of Hellas, a philosopher who united love of reflection with a rare interest for his time in observing the real world. Philip understood that his son was destined not merely to inherit a throne, but to govern a complex state, wage wars, forge alliances, and build an empire. He wanted the education of the future ruler to be entrusted to a man capable not only of imparting knowledge but of shaping a sovereign's way of thinking, teaching him to understand the nature of things, the laws of society, and the structure of the world. When Aristotle arrived in Macedonia, Alexander was 13 years old. Even then, the boy displayed qualities that would later astonish contemporaries and posterity alike: a lively mind, curiosity, phenomenal memory, a hunger for knowledge, extraordinary resolve, and confidence in his own exceptional destiny. At the same time, he was quick-tempered, stubborn, at times excessively bold, an energy that needed to be channeled into constructive pursuits. A special residence was chosen for lessons in Mieza, a picturesque place not far from the capital, Pella, removed from political intrigue, the noisy court, and urban bustle. There, in seclusion among forests and hills, Aristotle and his pupil spent long days absorbed in study, conversation, observation of nature, and reflection on the meaning of life, power, justice, and the order of the world. The curriculum Aristotle devised encompassed the entire spectrum of contemporary knowledge. Its core consisted of philosophy, ethics, logic, rhetoric, and poetry. Special attention was devoted to history, geography, mathematics, and astronomy. Aristotle believed a future ruler must be able to express his thoughts clearly and precisely, understand the laws of nature, perceive connections between phenomena, and reflect not only on war and politics but also on the enduring questions: good, evil, justice, and human purpose. Rhetoric occupied a central place. Aristotle taught Alexander the art of speech, how to structure an address, which arguments to employ, how to influence listeners, how to guide emotions with words, direct thought, inspire people, or, on the contrary, calm them. Together they examined exemplary speeches of great orators, analyzed myths and poetry, and discussed the power of language and its effect on minds. No less attention was given to the study of nature. Faithful to his love of observation, Aristotle held that understanding nature's laws was essential for any ruler. Together they studied plants and animals, the changing of the seasons, and the structure of the celestial bodies. These lessons were anything but abstract. They taught Alexander to see the world as a system governed by definite laws, laws whose comprehension is necessary for the successful governance of people. A special topic of discussion was the state, social order, and the role of law and justice. Aristotle explained that power is not simply force, but, above all, responsibility. They examined different forms of government: monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, discussing their strengths and weaknesses and the causes of prosperity and decline. The teacher convinced Alexander that a stable state is impossible without just law, balance of interests, and an understanding of society's nature. Testimonies have survived that Aristotle prepared for Alexander a special selection of books he deemed necessary for any ruler. Among them were the poems of Homer, especially the Iliad, which became for Alexander an almost sacred book. It is said he always kept it under his pillow together with his sword and never parted with it on campaign. According to tradition, Aristotle prepared a special annotated edition for him, explaining how to read Homer not only as poetry but as a guide to life. Relations between Aristotle and Alexander were anything but simple. Alexander was too independent and too proud to accept any truth unquestioningly, even when voiced by a great philosopher. He often argued, asked questions, and demanded explanations. And Aristotle, accustomed to freedom of thought and debate, encouraged this independence in his pupil. Their conversations, filled with argument and the search for truth, formed the intellectual foundation that would remain with Alexander forever. The instruction lasted about 3 years, until Alexander turned 16. During that period, when setting off on another military campaign, Philip left his son as regent of Macedonia. This decision confirmed that Alexander had passed from the state of pupil to that of statesman. For Aristotle, it was a sign that his primary mission had been accomplished. Nevertheless, their connection did not end. When a few years later, Alexander set out on his great Eastern campaign. He instructed his commanders and officials to collect for Aristotle information about rare animals, plants, minerals, and the customs and culture of conquered peoples. Thanks to this, Aristotle was later able to assemble a unique body of factual material that became the basis for many of his scientific works. Service at Philip's court was not merely an episode in Aristotle's biography. It gave him access to resources, libraries, and people, and made him a figure of enormous authority throughout the Hellenic world. This period strengthened his conviction that he must found his own school, where knowledge of the world would not only be transmitted but also comprehended, systematized, and developed. When Alexander was about to embark on the path of great conquests and Macedonia prepared for radical changes, Aristotle understood that his work there was complete. The time had come to return to Athens, the city that had once been his home, and that now was to become the place where he would realize his chief design, to create a school that would unite philosophy and science, reason and experience, observation and reflection. When in the year 335 before our era Aristotle returned to Athens, he came back not as a disciple of Plato and not as a private philosopher, but as a mature thinker, teacher, scholar, and public figure with an impeccable reputation. Behind him stood immense experience, nearly 20 years in the academy, then years of intense research in Assos and Mytilene, service at the court of the Macedonian king Philip II, and the education of Alexander, the young man who in the coming years would change the face of the entire ancient world. Aristotle returned to Athens with a clear purpose, to found his own school and embody in it his vision of proper education and of what true knowledge should be. Athens of the late 4th century before our era greeted him altered. Formally, the city remained independent, but Macedonian influence was evident. Many citizens resented this, though most had grown accustomed to the new political reality. Yet despite political changes, the intellectual life of Athens continued to thrive. Debates, teaching, writing, and reflection persisted as before. Aristotle deliberately did not return to the academy. His views had completely diverged from Platonic conceptions of being. He no longer believed that truth resides in a world of abstract ideas. His method was different, to rely on observation, experience, and the systematic study of the surrounding world. For this, he needed not merely a venue for philosophical conversations, but a full scientific and educational center that would unite theory and practice. The site for the school was chosen near the sanctuary of Apollo Lyceus. There stood a gymnasium ringed by gardens and colonnades, with spacious alleys perfect for walking. From this place the school received its name, the Lyceum, and its students came to be called Peripatetics, the strollers, because much instruction took place during unhurried walks in the shade of trees. From its first days, the Lyceum differed from all other educational institutions in Greece. Whereas Plato's academy was primarily a place for dialectical discussions about the nature of the ideal, eternal and unchanging essences, Aristotle created a school in which knowledge rested not only on reasoning, but above all on observation of the real world. He proceeded from the belief that truth is hidden in the nature of things themselves and therefore must be sought not in abstract speculation, but in the study of the world in all its diversity. The structure of instruction in the Lyceum was carefully organized. In the mornings, Aristotle delivered lectures for the inner circle of students, the so-called acroamatic lectures. These were the most difficult courses on metaphysics, logic, physics, ethics, psychology, politics, rhetoric, and poetics. There they examined the most intricate questions: the nature of causes, the essence of being, motion, the structure of the soul, the mechanisms of cognition, the regularities of state development, and the role of virtue in human life. Afternoons and evenings were devoted to exoteric lectures, more accessible talks not only for regular students but for all who wished to attend. These sessions explored practical philosophy, rhetoric, political order, history, and education. They were intended for a broader audience: merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and young men preparing for public life. But the Lyceum was more than a school. It was a research center. Aristotle saw his task not only as transmitting knowledge, but as constantly augmenting it. He organized the collection of factual data about nature, human beings, governmental systems, cultures, and customs. Students of the Lyceum traveled through Greece, Asia Minor, the Aegean Islands, and Egypt, recording, observing, and gathering everything that could illuminate the world. Within the Lyceum, he created one of the first scientific libraries in history. Aristotle devoted enormous attention to collecting, systematizing, and cataloging texts. He compiled lists of books, arranged them by subject, and wrote detailed commentaries and indexes. This library soon became the largest repository of knowledge in all of Hellas. The Lyceum also became, in effect, the first scientific laboratory. There they conducted animal dissections, observed embryonic development, studied the habits of birds, fish, and insects, and described plants, minerals, and climatic phenomena. Aristotle believed nature could not be understood without careful observation of its manifestations. Research was collaborative. If in the academy philosophy had remained largely the work of individual contemplation, in the Lyceum they worked together. Groups of students pursued different lines of inquiry. Some studied animal structure, others gathered data on plants, still others described the political systems of various city-states. All this information flowed to Aristotle, who strove to incorporate it into a comprehensive picture of the world. Aristotle himself took part in the daily work of the school. His days were scheduled by the hour: morning lectures for students, midday meetings of research groups, evening public talks, and afterward work on his own writings. In his free time, if it can be called that, he spent hours conversing with students, refining terms, correcting formulations, and verifying observations. The Lyceum was not merely a school or research center. It embodied the idea that knowledge is not the accumulation of abstract truths, but a living, continuous labor of the mind in which observation joins analysis and reflection joins experience. In the Lyceum, for the first time in history, philosophy was systematically united with the natural sciences, logic with empirical data, and metaphysics with concrete facts. This principle, the union of theory and practice, logic and observation, knowledge and experience, became the foundation not only of Hellenistic science, but of the entire Western intellectual tradition. It was here, in the Lyceum, that the model of the university was born, a space where thought is free, where knowledge is tested by experience, and where every question gives rise to a new turn in the search. Once the Lyceum was working at full strength, Aristotle devoted himself wholly to what he regarded as the highest calling of his life, to create a coherent, systematic picture of the world that would encompass every field of knowledge accessible to human beings. This was not merely an educational project or a philosophical school. He was building the first scientific encyclopedia in human history, meant to unite data about nature, society, language, culture, the state, and the human being. At the foundation of this titanic labor was Aristotle's firm conviction that truth must rest not only on reason and argument, but above all, on experience, observation, and careful investigation of reality. All knowledge, he believed, must be systematized, revealing the causes, structures, and regularities of phenomena. Unlike Plato, who set forth his views in finely wrought literary dialogues, Aristotle wrote works of a strictly scientific character. His texts are either lecture notes or internal outlines for the school. Their style is dry, dense with definitions, lists, classifications, and logical schemas, lacking literary ornament yet extremely precise and analytical. At the base of his entire intellectual system stood logic, a discipline Aristotle effectively created. Before him, there was no formal doctrine of the laws of correct thinking. He was the first to describe the structure of deductive reasoning and to formulate the notion of the syllogism, a logical construction in which a conclusion necessarily follows from two premises. For example, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Aristotle gathered his logical writings under the collective title organon, meaning instrument, logic as the tool of thought required by all other sciences. This cycle included categories, analyzing fundamental types of predication, on interpretation, on the structure of propositions, prior analytics, which developed the theory of syllogisms, posterior analytics, devoted to scientific demonstration, topics on methods of dialectical reasoning, and on sophistical refutations, which examined fallacious arguments. Physics for Aristotle was not a narrow discipline, but the science of nature as a whole. In the treatise Physics, he explored motion, change, place, time, coming to be and passing away, and the structure of nature. There he formulated his renowned doctrine of the four causes: the material cause, what a thing is made of; the formal cause, what makes a thing the kind of thing it is; the efficient cause, what brings it into being or sets it in motion; the final cause, the end or purpose for which it exists. A special place in his legacy belongs to his biological works. In them, Aristotle described more than 500 species of animals, and many of his observations proved so accurate that they remained unsurpassed until the early modern period. His history of animals, on the parts of animals, on the motion of animals, and on the generation of animals constituted the first attempt to create a zoological classification. He divided animals by the presence or absence of blood, a category that in modern biology roughly corresponds to the division between vertebrates and invertebrates. With remarkable attentiveness, he studied the development of living organisms. In his embryological writings, he described in detail the development of a chick in the egg, from the first appearance of blood vessels to the formation of organs, observing that development proceeds gradually, step by step, from the indeterminate to the determinate, from the simple to the complex. No less important were his works on psychology, or more precisely, on the philosophy of the soul, as it was then understood. In On the Soul, he proposed treating the soul not as a separate substance, but as the form of a living body, that which makes an organism alive. He distinguished 3 levels of soul: the vegetative, responsible for nutrition, growth, and reproduction, present in plants, animals, and human beings; the animal, associated with perception, sensation, and movement, present in animals and human beings; the rational, capable of intellect, present only in human beings. In the social sciences, Aristotle produced foundational works on politics and ethics. His politics was based not on speculative models, but on the study of real governmental systems. Together with his students, he collected information on more than 150 constitutions of Greek cities, carefully analyzing them and identifying the causes of stability and collapse. Only one, the Athenian constitution, has survived, but the corpus was known to be vast. His rhetoric became the first systematic guide to the art of persuasion. Aristotle distinguished 3 elements of effective speech: logos, logical content; pathos, emotional appeal; and ethos, the speaker's credibility and character. In the Poetics, he created the first theory of art and history. He analyzed drama, above all tragedy, introducing such concepts as catharsis, purification through pity and fear; peripeteia, a sudden reversal in the hero's fortune; and recognition, the moment of grasping a hidden truth. He explained how plot construction, character, and action affect the audience. Aristotle's method rested on a strict union of induction and deduction. He began with observation of many particular facts, identified general regularities, formulated principles, and then tested them on new examples. For the first time in history, he clearly articulated the idea of inductive generalization, movement from the particular to the universal. He also created the first classification of the sciences, dividing them into theoretical, physics, metaphysics, mathematics, sciences whose end is truth; practical, ethics, politics, sciences of right action; and productive or poetic, the arts, rhetoric, sciences of making or creating. Each discipline had its own subject matter, methods, and aims. This structure became the foundation of the subsequent scientific tradition of Europe. The system he created encompassed the entire world, from the organization of a marine mollusk's body to the structure of the cosmos and of political systems. Aristotle was the first in history to attempt a comprehensive, logically ordered description of reality in all its variety. Work on this intellectual encyclopedia continued until the end of his life. Not only Aristotle himself, but the entire Lyceum community took part. Students gathered materials, made observations, described and classified, helping their teacher to erect an edifice of knowledge for which the ancient world had no equal. In the year 323 before our era, the entire Hellenic world was shaken by news that seemed impossible. In Babylon, Alexander of Macedon died suddenly. The death of a man who in just a few years had altered the map of the world, bringing lands from Greece to India under his rule, instantly destroyed the fragile balance that had held across the empire. Countries and cities subject to Macedonia immediately rose in revolt, civil wars flared, and the Greek police hurried to seize the moment to try to restore their lost independence. Athens, like many other cities, was quickly swept by a wave of anti-Macedonian sentiment. Popular assemblies arose. Voices called to expel all who were connected with Macedonia, who had enjoyed Macedonian patronage, or who simply supported alliance with the Macedonian royal house. At once, philosophers and scholars fell under suspicion, anyone linked in any way to the royal court, and above all, Aristotle. His ties to Macedonia were obvious to everyone. Tutor of Alexander, friend of Philip II's family, a man whose school had long existed with the support of Macedonian rulers. Though Aristotle himself had never held public office, never took part in governance, and was more an observer than a participant in political processes, his name was among the first against whom accusations were brought. The formal pretext was a charge of impiety, offending the gods. On this very charge, Socrates had once been sentenced to death, and although almost 80 years had passed since then, the accusation remained exceedingly dangerous, especially when the crowd's judgment was clouded by fear, resentment, and the search for culprits. Aristotle understood perfectly how it might end. Sources preserve his famous words, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin against philosophy a second time." With that resolve, he left the city at once. Without delay, without public speeches, without any attempt to justify himself before the assembly, he set out for Euboea, to the city of Chalcis, his mother's homeland, and the place where part of the family property and a house had remained since his youth. There, at a distance from the tempests that engulfed mainland Greece, he intended to spend the rest of his life. In Chalcis, the philosopher settled quickly. The house stood not far from the shore, ringed by olive groves and gardens, and the city itself, though unsettled, was not drawn into events with the same force as Athens. Aristotle continued to teach. Students from the Lyceum came to him, bringing texts, drafts, and notes, discussing with him the hardest questions of metaphysics, logic, the natural sciences, politics, and ethics. The work did not diminish. On the contrary, it became more focused and purposeful, as though the philosopher sensed that little time remained and hurried to complete what still required refinement. The sources do not name the precise cause of his death. By one account, he suffered from a chronic stomach ailment that had accompanied him since youth. By another, illness was compounded by the consequences of stress, overwork, and the worsened conditions of life after his hasty departure from Athens. In any case, when he arrived in Chalcis, he was about 62 years old, an age considered highly venerable by ancient standards. Despite deteriorating health, Aristotle worked almost to his last day. He dictated corrections to his treatises, reviewed old notes, and systematized materials gathered over many years. Descriptions of animals, observations of the stars, treatises on poetics, rhetoric, politics, and logic. Toward the end of his life, he increasingly sought solitude in the garden, sitting for long stretches in the shade of trees, watching clouds, birds, and the wind, the very phenomena of nature that had nourished his reflections since early childhood. One of the philosopher's final requests, as the sources relate, was to be buried beside his wife Pythias, who had died earlier. He left clear instructions regarding his burial, his property, and above all, the fate of the Lyceum. He insisted that the school continue its work in his absence and entrusted its leadership to Theophrastus, his closest friend, pupil, and colleague, already recognized as a distinguished scholar and botanist, the author of his own works on the plant world. Aristotle died in the year 322 before our era. That year proved tragic both for him personally and for Athens. It was then that the Lycian War began, the last attempt by Athens and several Greek polis to throw off Macedonian domination. The war would end in defeat. Athens would finally lose its political independence, but Aristotle would not live to know it. Little has been preserved about his death. There is no mention of solemn funerals or official honors. Aristotle's remains were interred in Chalcis, on the family estate, beside his wife, in accordance with his will. Thus ended the path of a man who, perhaps more than any other in human history, sought to create a complete picture of the world, one that bound together the organization of the state and the structure of a marine mollusk's body, the nature of the soul, and the motion of the heavenly bodies, the art of speech, and the laws of thought. A man who inaugurated entire sciences, methods, and concepts that would undergird human thought for thousands of years to come. When in the year 322 before our era, Aristotle's remains were laid to rest in Chalcis, few could have foreseen that his works would not merely outlive their author, but become the intellectual foundation for entire eras. They would outlast the fall of the Greek city-states, the dissolution of the Alexandrian Empire, the collapse of Roman power, and the darkness of the early Middle Ages. They would be reborn within European universities, help ignite scientific revolutions, and endure into our own day. Immediately after Aristotle's death, his work was continued by his closest student and friend, Theophrastus. He took charge of the Lyceum, preserved the library, archives, drafts, and the school's very tradition. Theophrastus became not only an outstanding botanist and naturalist, but also the organizer who systematized a significant portion of the materials left by his teacher. Under him, the Lyceum continued to flourish, remaining an influential center of science and education for nearly 2 centuries. With the advent of the Hellenistic age, philosophical centers shifted from Athens to Alexandria, Pergamum, Rhodes, and other great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. There, in the greatest library of Alexandria, Aristotle's works were stored, studied, and copied. Scholars of that period strove not only to preserve but also to comprehend accumulated knowledge, to systematize it, and to continue the investigation of nature, logic, politics, and ethics. Late antiquity greeted the Aristotelian tradition ambivalently. Neoplatonists, Stoics, and skeptics argued with him, corrected his ideas, rejecting some theses and accepting others. Yet in logic, biology, rhetoric, and political theory, Aristotle's works remained authoritative and in demand. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the coming of the early Middle Ages in the West, a large part of Aristotle's corpus was lost. For several centuries, the Latin world knew Aristotle chiefly as the author of logical treatises, categories, on interpretation, and topics. Everything else, physics, psychology, politics, rhetoric, was forgotten or simply unavailable. But in the East, in Byzantium, and especially in the Arabic-speaking world, the Aristotelian tradition not only survived, but flourished. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, Muslim scholars translated Aristotle's works from Greek into Arabic, commented on them, debated him, developed his ideas, and enriched them with their own discoveries. It was the Arabic world that became the bridge by which Aristotelian philosophy returned to Europe. From the beginning of the 12th century, Europe launched a vast movement to translate Arabic and Greek texts into Latin. By the 13th century, Aristotle's works again became accessible to European scholars and philosophers. They swiftly entered the core of university education and became part of the standard curriculum. Medieval schools, especially in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, and Florence, built much of their instruction upon Aristotelian logic, metaphysics, ethics, and politics. Thomas Aquinas and other 13th century scholastics integrated Aristotle's philosophy into Christian theology, creating a grand synthesis of reason and faith. His doctrine of causality, his notions of form and matter, and his theory of ends became instruments for explaining not only natural phenomena, but the divine order of the world. For several centuries, Aristotelian physics remained the official picture of the universe. It dominated European universities until the beginning of the 17th century, when it yielded to a new scientific worldview grounded in the discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. Astonishingly, although Aristotle's physical models were overturned, his method, the drive to systematize, the search for causes, the attention to observation and classification, became the foundation of the new science. The Aristotelian idea of inductive generalization, movement from observation to the formulation of general laws, lay at the base of the scientific revolution. During the Renaissance, Aristotle was read, studied, and debated anew. Leonardo da Vinci, Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, and Isaac Newton refuted his physics, yet, in essence, worked within the same paradigm, seeking explanations of natural phenomena through observation, measurement, and analysis. In the modern era, Aristotle's works remained integral to humanistic education. Logic, rhetoric, ethics, and political philosophy stayed alive and continued to develop. In the 19th century, a fresh wave of interest arose in Aristotle as a historian of science and the first great systematizer of human knowledge. In the 20th and 21st centuries, his legacy became an inseparable part of global intellectual culture. Aristotle remains a required subject of study in universities across the world. His contributions to logic are still a point of departure for formal systems, the philosophy of language, and the foundations of mathematics. His approach to biological classification undergirded all of modern systematics. His works on ethics and politics remain central to debates amid new challenges, from bioethics to artificial intelligence and law. Today, Aristotle is once again timely. His teachings on causes, ends, form, and matter are applied in the philosophy of science, bioinformatics, engineering, and the cognitive sciences. His reflections on balancing the particular and the universal, on seeking the mean between extremes, have helped shape many contemporary ethical frameworks. Yet perhaps Aristotle's greatest legacy is not a compendium of facts, a set of categories or tables of biological classification. It is an attitude toward the world, toward knowledge, toward thinking itself. The conviction that reality is intelligible, that it can be studied, that it obeys rational regularities. The confidence that truth reveals itself to the one who observes attentively, reasons precisely, and knows how to ask the right questions. The name of Aristotle has become a symbol of the striving to understand the world as a whole, in all its complexity, in all its manifestations, in its endless variety. His legacy is not merely a body of knowledge. It is a call to an unending search for truth, to an unending pursuit of understanding that is never final, but always the next step on the path toward greater knowledge.